I did edit the all right. So we had just started talking about his concept of the general will. And as I'm going back and I'm reviewing all this, I'm beginning to see some connections with Hobbes here that I haven't before. So as we go through this stuff today, I may talk a little bit about that. I emailed our new guy who's coming in next fall because he's a Rousseau expert, and I said, do you see any possibility that Rousseau is trying to correct Hobbes in a way, that he's trying to, in fact, he thinks like Hobbes, but he wants to correct some of Hobbes's mistakes? Mm-hmm. I'm beginning to wonder, which would be a view of Rousseau very different from the common view, which is that he's the philosopher of freedom and individualism and so forth. But even without that, I think you'll see the picture is not that clear. Rousseau is a tricky thinker. He's hard to figure out. So we talked about how the general will is composed by all people who give up their right to everything and think in terms of what will be good for all. And, one of the questions that people have is this really just a concept, or is he expecting this to be a reality? Is it a standard? Because if it's a standard about how people ought to think, then it kind of makes sense. You want people to think in terms of what law will we pass that will benefit all people, right? And that's what maybe what you might call true citizenship when you think in that way, right? And but on the other hand, the liberal even will have this in mind, that when you go into the voting booth, ideally you want to think about the common good and how it matches up with your good. But the liberal says, but in reality, people will vote lots of times on their self-interest or their particular, economic sector, faction, whatever. Is Rousseau expecting more than that? What does he really mean by that? If it's just a standard of conduct, then it seems more reasonable than if he expects a political system to somehow produce the level of consensus and sort of self-denial that would be necessary to produce the general will in practice. But then some of the things that he proposes later on in the book, in part 2 and part 3, seem to indicate that he's putting into place mechanisms that will really change people's minds and make them, or help them to think differently, less about themselves as individuals and more about the whole. So, okay, so one question that people raise is this question of positivism. So I have to explain that. One objection to the idea of the general will is that Rousseau is rejecting the role of natural law in its entirety. And this is one area that reminded me of Hobbes. Remember, Hobbes has the natural law, that he gives us over 20 different natural laws, but he says that they are no good in nature and they're no good in civil society either, except for if the sovereign...
I see where he's trying to challenge Hobbes. Is that where you kind of got that?
Well, is he or is he not? Okay, because... previously, we looked at a quote last time where he was definitely challenging Hobbes, and I don't think he completely agrees with him. But Rousseau does agree that the natural law is not, well, he doesn't even really deal with the natural law. His state of nature does not produce a natural law. Yeah? There's no natural law there, and once the social contract is created, the people's general will is not guided by a natural law. Okay. The only way that you could possibly see natural law going on in Rousseau's thought is if you say that through thinking about what is good for all, you would naturally come up with rules that might resemble a natural law. Does that make sense? Okay. But he doesn't use this terminology, and that would be an extrapolation on what Rousseau is actually saying. So many people say Rousseau is saying that whatever the general will comes up with, which could vary from time to time and place to place, is the only law, and that there's no higher standard than the general will. And really, there's a lot of spots in this book where you can find evidence for that there's no standard higher than the general will.
So what it sounds like he's describing is almost like a direct democracy in its like rawest form.
Yeah, a very direct democracy, right? But yet, with, for instance, Athens' direct democracy, yeah, people were guided by patriotism and there was some effort to achieve a sort of national pride that was supposed to lead to unity, but there weren't maybe as many efforts in that direction as there are here. He's going to end up with a pretty strong, socialization to create the general will, right? But yeah, it's everybody coming together and deciding. So in that sense, it's going to be very direct democracy. And in that setting, is there any law higher than the will of the people? Well, they're the sovereign. They're the sovereign. That's what he says. The people are the sovereign.
Though there is a sovereign?
Well,
well, that's what I was confused about. Like,
there's going to be a lawgiver and there's going to be a sort of leader, you might say. But when he uses,
still everybody's sovereign, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
The people are sovereign. They are the true sovereign. Okay.
I just can't imagine a system where a leader doesn't become the sovereign.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't see how that could possibly work. That's my only. I mean, I know he tries to do a good job of explaining of how it's supposed to work in book 2, but I'm just not buying into it.
I'm seeing a lot of
Yeah.
Well, he ends up telling us there's going to be a founder that sets this all up, that's going to create a sort of sense of reverence. There's going to be leaders as well, so it's not just the people spontaneously getting together and coming up with ideas on their own. There's going to be a civil religion, there's going to be censorship, there's going to be all these things that will help to mold and shape this popular will. But he is going to try to argue that these institutions are not separate from the general will. Okay, so charitably, Rousseau is struggling with this. How do you create absolute consensus so that every person feels represented about every issue, so their will is the same as the laws that are passed in every case? How do you do that?
Well, with that, that's what I was going to say. Like, I mean, no laws are going to get passed because there's going to be at least one or two individuals that always think a law is going to hurt them, right? In some fashion.
You would think so.
So, is there even going to be any laws? That's the question. Because then everybody wouldn't be agreeing to it. So
he tries to
people are
deal
going to be
with
so
that.
self-consumed with the good of the others that
I guess that's true.
Right.
I'm
Ideally,
just thinking from our time perspective. I guess this would.
you could never
Never.
have this,
Yeah.
going,
No.
even with a group of 10
No.
people, probably.
Well, the thing is, I don't even know if this would happen during his time. Like, if this could even be possible, it'd have to be way before.
Mhm.
Like, it's almost like he's writing, like, to go back in time.
Well, that
Try to
shouldn't
change.
surprise us.
Yeah.
It's sort of tribal
Yeah.
mentality, yeah. Well, and maybe it is just an ideal standard. I mean, maybe, this is the way it should be, but can never be. But he is kind of like Plato's Republic. He's going to try to, it's as though, Glaucon's there saying, okay, Rousseau, how are you going to actually accomplish this? And he says, okay, I'll write book 2, and I'll tell you how I'm going to accomplish this general will. So he's going to try to show us how it could possibly be done, and I think it's up to us to decide whether those measures are justified and would work.
But I think Plato at least throws a bone to the fact that human nature won't allow for his republic, and I didn't see any.
I haven't seen any.
He seems to take himself really seriously.
Yeah.
You don't see any caveats there.
Yeah.
In the Republic, Socrates says, I know this can't work, right? He comes right out and says it. I know that, people are flawed, and I know that no regime can last, and there's a difference between theory and practice. And you're right, you don't see that in Rousseau. So you're getting the sense that he's much more positive, and that's why people react strongly to these ideas. Many people think he is advocating something very oppressive. In the name of total freedom, that you get, these institutions that he proposes seem so oppressive, because how else are you going to create consensus amongst individuals, especially when he admits we cannot go back to a pre-civilized state. People are socialized. They're going to be thinking like individuals, and we're going to have to use means to sort of turn them around and make them think differently than they do at this point in time. So the problem of positivism is the idea that there is no standard of law higher than whatever the popular will says. And that creates a problem, because if the popular will says, we want to exclude all non-white people, for instance, from our country, okay? Or we want to force people to worship in a certain way, then this becomes absolutely the law and absolutely what justice is, if you don't have any higher standard of justice that the natural law represents.
If I'm taking book 2 right, if I'm understanding it correctly, did he say that kind of the judiciary or decider of this would be the whole group?
Ultimately,
or
it is.
Or do they appoint? Because it was a little confusing to me, if I remember correctly, how he worded it.
Leaders emerge.
Uh-huh.
Clearly, leaders emerge from this group, just as they would did back in ancient Athens.
But is it those leaders that decide like the fate of people if they break those
Well,
laws?
okay, here's the thing. The leaders will put forward proposals,
Mm-hmm.
and the general will, the people, will accept or
Yeah,
deny.
yeah, that's right.
Right.
Okay.
So in that way, the general will is still in charge. The people are still in charge through their general will. So they are not supposedly imposed upon. But you know how, human psychology works, and so does Rousseau.
Mm-hmm.
And so he would think that most of the time, unless something that is proposed is outrageously against everybody's interest, it's going to be approved. So a leader could have a lot of real power in this situation. But there is supposedly this line in the sand. You can't propose something that is so obviously against the majority's will. I hate to use that term because he would not. But there has to be enough people to oppose it that, you can't have, because if you just have a few people oppose it, we know Rousseau is going to say, you can force them to be free, right? You can force them to basically agree. It's to not go against the general will.
See, and that's the scary part, because there are a lot of things that you can, as we have seen, that appear to be for the good of the general, public,
Mm-hmm.
that turn out to not be so good for, general public. So I just don't know how someone's reading this, wow, what a pinnacle of freedom and equality Rousseau was.
Right. Well, yeah, it's a misreading and probably a naive and superficial reading of what Rousseau said. It certainly was, Rousseau was one of the darlings of the 60s, hippie commune movement. And, they certainly didn't pick up on the the oppression part of Rousseau's teaching. They also were slow to figure out Stalin and Stalinism as well. So maybe it's a naivete, maybe the eternal hope that, as I've said before, we can get it right this time, but there were a lot of people attracted to these ideas without seeing the other side. I think one of the services that Rousseau does for us is he shows us just where you have to stop in your attempt to achieve consensus, at the point where freedom becomes non-freedom. So yes, the consensus is very important to him, and in order to achieve that consensus, we see these measures. Well, one of the measures that he talks about is punishment. Let's go ahead and look at that, of those who do not conform to the general will. Well, what you're supposed to do if you're if you're one of the few who disagree is you're supposed to rethink your thinking. Okay? So you're supposed to ask yourself, okay, am I thinking selfishly here?
Well, yeah, I found that interesting whenever I read that.
Mm-hmm. it wouldn't be conducive to independent thought, would it? You know, because a lot of times when we stand up for something, we do
We
feel,
believe in it, yeah.
yeah. And we ask ourselves, am I possibly wrong here? And then we say to ourselves, no, I'm really not. And then you go ahead and say what you want anyway. But here,
He just put like a lot of faith in the individual in that case to come out and just support the group.
to think
Yeah.
in the common good.
Mhm.
Now, what we will do is we'll say, okay, I've thought seriously about it. I think the majority is wrong. I'm going to say what I think. Why do we think the majority is wrong? Because we have some source of higher standard upon which to judge the vote that took place in the Kansas legislature or whatever. And so Rousseau is eliminating that higher standard, theoretically, by saying that, you know, the source of law is nothing other than the will of the people.
So that takes away any like form of legitimacy or justification if you even tried to go against it.
Yes, right. You don't have any theoretical justification. I mean, all you can say is, it doesn't work for me. I don't like it. You know, it doesn't, and that doesn't sound very good to say that. It doesn't work for me. It's not good for me is a selfish statement. If you could make an argument that it is not just because either God's laws or natural law, you know, go against it, then you would have something to hang your hat on. But you don't in this system. So that's a problem for the individual. Let's see, on page 433, down at the bottom and going on to 434, we see this development of this idea of forcing the individual. He says, in fact, each individual can, as a man, have a private will, that is, as a subject. He uses the term subject above. So there's subject and citizen, and you're both, okay? So as a subject, you're a private individual. Each individual can, as a man, have a private will contrary to or different from the general will that he has as a citizen. His private interest can speak to him in an entirely different manner from the common interest. His absolute and naturally independent existence can cause him to envisage that what he owes to the common cause as a gratuitous contribution, the loss of which will be less harmful to others than its payment is burdensome to him. And in viewing the moral person, which constitutes the state, as a being of reason because it is not a man, he would enjoy the rights of a citizen without wanting to fill the duties of a subject. An injustice whose growth would bring about the ruin of the body politic. Okay, so he has a duties as, a subject, and he has rights as a citizen. Okay, so by asserting his individual rights, okay, against the general will, he is not fulfilling his duty as a subject to the whole. So thus, he says, in order for the social compact to avoid being an empty formula, and here's seems to me Hobbes coming in again here, it tacitly entails the commitment which alone can give force to the others, that whoever refuses to obey the general will be forced to do so by the entire body. This means merely that he will be forced to be free. For this is the sort of condition that, by giving each citizen to the homeland, guarantees against all personal dependence. This is where it gets kind of weird. A condition that produces the skill and performance of the political machine, and which alone bestows legitimacy upon civil commitments. Without it, such commitments would be absurd, tyrannical, and subject to the worst abuses.
That seems kind of contradictory.
It seems contradictory, doesn't it?
It's pretty contradictory.
But if you are not, see here's, and you call it twisted thinking or whatever, but it's worth contemplating. If you're not in agreement with the general will, but you have to go along with it, which is what we do, okay, in our everyday lives, I'm not in full agreement with the Kansas legislature. Sounds like none of you are either right now. But we do obey the laws, okay? And we just say to ourselves, well, in the next election, we'll try to elect somebody else and see how it goes. Rousseau would say this is tyrannical. So you have to have a situation where we And I mean, obviously, in his case, it wouldn't be the legislature, it'd be an assembly of all. We are in agreement with what they decide, or else we will be tyrannized over.
But I mean, technically, we have those means. We could all go to the legislature during committee and make their lives really miserable,
Yes.
such that they're compelled to do what we want.
Yeah,
Or we could, just bother them more.
that's true.
But we don't.
But when people get really hot and bothered about something, they do. I mean, it does happen, and then things do happen.
From my experience, a lot of it was like when the bills were on the floor. Like, well, at least from like my peers, they would say, "Oh, stop bill," and like, "Well, you should have been there in committee, so it
Right.
didn't even get out of there."
Yeah.
And then the people who do have the time are usually the people who are championing these bills, who are like, don't worry about it, we'll take
Who
it.
oftentimes are getting paid to be there, so they have the time and
Mhm.
they're there. So it's hard for us to get to Topeka, let alone the halls of Congress. And that is part of the bad as well as the good of a representative system and a large country such as we have. So what Rousseau is envisaging is something smaller. In fact, in here he extols Geneva, which is a city-state, founded by Calvin. Okay, that's how he sees it. Founded by Calvin, who by other people's measures was quite oppressive, actually. If you didn't go along with the religion of Calvin, you weren't welcome in Geneva. And it was pretty staunch stuff, there were a lot of morality became the law. Christian morality became the law in Calvin's Geneva. So if you weren't good for going along with all of that and all of the social pressure that came with it, you didn't want to live there. And so Rousseau, when he moved back to Geneva, did so, and probably, and he adopted the Calvinistic religion, but probably didn't believe all of it, but totally appreciated the value of it for creating this total homogeneity in thought amongst these people. Now, if you lived in Geneva and just really couldn't go along with even the value of the moral laws, you would not feel welcome there, and you probably would either be forced to flee or forced to be free. So that's his ideal.
Does he mean forced to be free? Does he mean killing them?
No,
Or does
no.
he
Well,
mean or does he mean returning to the state of nature? Or I'm just kind of confused about that.
you're going to be threatened with some sort of punishment. Now,
okay.
I mean, ultimately, maybe death might be the ultimate punishment, but does he say that? I don't think he actually says that.
Forced to be free, like killing.
No.
That almost seems like if you don't agree with the general will, and people obviously know that you don't agree with it, then they're going to try to either indoctrinate you or brainwash you into believing it. It's
Right. That would be much more likely. So you get this vision of re-education camps, right? I mean, think of what not so nice people can do with these ideas. This is the part of, where you get the French Revolutionary radicalism and all the movements after that. Yes, we have a good idea, and no, it is not okay for you to disagree with it because we do know. And so,
I don't know, something about the forced to be free part. I think if you'd left that out, it's still kind of sketchy, but that kind of brings to light, anyone reading forcing you to be free. Am I really free if I'm forced?
Well, yeah, that's what I was gonna say. It's just kind of like a never-ending loop, because if you're forced to agree, that's not true consensus.
right.
So it's not the true general will.
Isn't it interesting that
Meaning there shouldn't be a law.
the guy who said that
You
you
know?
can't be forced to enter into the social contract through conquest is now saying it's okay to take the individual and more or less make them rethink their decision.
Yeah.
And but then if you don't see, and this is I think what's going on in Rousseau's mind, if you don't do this and you don't achieve this unanimity, what you get is this ever increasing individualism where people just say, I don't really care what, how other people live or what happens to them. I don't care if some people are poor and some people are rich. Okay, so I mean, one question to level at Rousseau is, do you really have to go to this extreme? Do you have to go all the way in order to get rid of or ameliorate some of these problems that he sees?
Well, I think that's kind of interesting in and of itself, thinking that way, because in his natural state, even though people don't interact with each other, he says that they're still going to have that sympathy towards other people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, did that just like stop when we entered, into civil society, or is that not a thing anymore? Because that's also very contradictory, saying, once we're in civil society and, if we have differences, we're all going to disagree with each other. Whereas in the natural state, he argues, even though none of us interact and we don't talk to each other, we're still going to try to help people because we're going to sympathize with them.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
I think competition and like those things he's like, oh, we're going to see competition, we're going to see differences. Like, it seems like he's trying to say that's enough for us to no longer want to get along and be nice.
Right, yeah, he doesn't want to tolerate that competition and those differences. Although one could say that they aren't all bad, or that they don't exclude people from also being sociable and kind and all of those good things as well, that you can have both of those going on at the same time. So, and I think what you're thinking is that wouldn't it be right, and wouldn't you expect people to look upon the small minority that's being told, forced to be free, with some empathy, right? And to say, no, wait a minute, I don't think we need to go this far, that we don't need to have this absolute and utter agreement. On the other hand, where the empathy is supposed to be in Rousseau's system is in the first decision making to begin with. As citizens, we're supposed to be thinking about, what is good for all, not creating legislation that will be, bad for some and good for others. And so, if that really was the case, if we all got together and created legislation that was truly good for all, then it would seem unreasonable for people to disagree. Then they would be wrong-headed. They wouldn't see that their interest lies with accepting this legislation. That's the way he's thinking, okay? If you really could make decisions like this, okay? So, I mean, I can see both sides of this. There's always going to be people who, okay, let's go along with the way Rousseau thinks. There's going to be people who don't get it. We are right, but they don't get it. Are we going to allow them to not get it and tolerate them? Or is their existence and their vocalizing of not getting it and disagreeing going to cause so much disruption to our system that we can't enjoy the benefits of this consensus? Okay, so he's going with, we can't have this dissent. And it reminds me of Hobbes. Hobbes has a very strong system of creating at least external consensus. Now, he stopped short of what Rousseau says, which is we really need to get these people to rethink. So he wants to get inside the person and to have them sincerely rethink their decision and to say, oh yeah, I guess I was wrong. And not just externally. Hobbes would say, okay, go worship at the Episcopalian Church. I don't care what whether you're an atheist or Jewish or a Muslim or whatever it is, but you're going to go at least publicly worship there, and we're not going to talk about what we think, okay? And you can go home and do whatever you want. But externally, we're going to have this uniformity because that's what creates peace. And then we're going to have a sovereign, in his case the king, not the people, that we give up all of our authority to. And that sovereign is going to create laws that are in everybody's interest because he sees it in his interest to do so. Again, that's ideally. So many philosophers, and it's very useful, but they do think in terms of ideally, not in terms of what could possibly go wrong. And this is where, conservatism comes in the 18th century with Edmund Burke, in the wake of the French Revolution, basically saying, oh yeah, what can go wrong here? Let's rethink exactly how much we want to pursue the absolute ideal because we have these real flawed individuals that are grappling with these ideas and they don't always carry them out ideally. Okay, another passage I wanted to highlight is in chapter 5 on the right of life or death. On the left-hand side, one paragraph down in that chapter, he says, the social treaty has as its purpose the conversation of the contracting parties. Whoever wills the end also wills the means, and these means are inseparable from some risks, even from some losses. Whoever wishes to preserve his life at the expense of others should also give it up for them when necessary, for the citizen is no longer judge of the peril to which the law wishes he be exposed. And when the prince has said to him, and there's a mention of a leader, he should die. If the prince says to him, it is expedient for the state that you should die, he should die. Because it is under this condition alone that he has lived in security up to then, and because his life is not only a kindness of nature, but a conditional gift of the state. So there he's very much disagreeing with Hobbes, is he not? Remember, Hobbes said, hey, the social contract is for individual self-preservation. So we give up all of our rights except self-preservation. Rousseau says we give up all of our rights.
Because your life is a gift of the state.
Our life becomes a gift of the state.
Then in return getting kindness.
Supposedly, unless the sovereign or the prince asks you to go to war and get killed. So he's asking for the complete abrogation and a much stronger identification with the whole people than Hobbes did. He kind of goes to the opposite extreme. With Hobbes, you wonder, how can you have a country when people don't have a motivation to potentially give their life for their country? Because who's going to join the military, or who's going to be effective in the military with that mentality? With Rousseau, you ask yourself, who's going to give up all of their rights, including the right to self-preservation to the state, to that extent, right up front, okay? Why is that a good deal?
Well, it seems like in here there's a shift from the plural sovereign to the prince singular sovereign. So suddenly we go from, we're all making laws, but the prince is killing people.
And the prince is there because of the will of the people, however.
Right, but he doesn't seem to say, like, oh, you're all gonna say you're gonna die.
No, yeah, right. No, it's the prince decides. What ends up happening is the prince decides, and unless the people object, it becomes the will of the people. So if the prince decides, let's raise an army and go, we have to defend ourselves or go conquer, unless the people in a very big way, gonna have to be most people, say no, then it's gonna happen, and then he's got the right to ask you to risk your life. Okay.
So this just kind of seems like going back to one of those, ideally, they're looking at it ideally and not what could go wrong. With this seems like it could just, it's advocating allowing whoever's in charge to kill off whoever they are as long as they say it's for the good of the populace.
Yeah, here you see a really, the development of a really ideological way of thinking. If we normally separate political philosophy from ideology, you see it kind of blending in Rousseau's thought. He understands the power of ideology, and ideology can make people want to do just this, to completely feel absorbed in the whole. This is what fascism was about, was that complete absorption into this much greater thing, right? Which was the people, supposedly, even though it ended up being Mussolini and Adolf Hitler and what they said. But it was couched in terms of, this is, National Socialism was what the Nazi Party was, the idea of everyone and of the folk. That was the people, racially, culturally, in every way united and represented by this figurehead.
It's always in the back of my head, that his idea is just going to lead to fascism eventually.
And again, we're
It's
seeing,
just so hard to prevent, you know?
because there's no stop, there's no, what we would call checks and balances here.
Yeah.
That's the.
And I mean, he tries to provide a valid case of how this can work and how it can happen. I just don't see it possible. Like we were saying earlier, in his time, how he could change the people's minds to get out of that individualistic thinking.
Hitler did.
Yeah, Hitler did.
But look what else Hitler did.
Right. See, that's the problem, is you can't have, and people do want, one of the things that they grappled with, psychologists in particular grappled with in the 20th century, was how could so many individuals, all with their own private lives and their special interests and so forth, and all of their families, how could they all get out in the streets and join this movement? And some people in denial say, well, everybody was afraid. But frankly, the truth is, no. There were an awful lot of Germans and an awful lot of Italians who, prior to Hitler and the National Socialist movement, were living their private lives, doing their thing, who joined this, wholeheartedly. And young people who joining the Hitler Youth and so forth. Why? Well, they said, there's this strong, deep-seated need in people that oftentimes gets expressed in religion, which especially in modern times, with religion being shaken, by the scientific revolution, the rise of the state, the larger state, with all of its power and so forth. And the Enlightenment creates this skepticism and the shaking of faith. And then this gets transferred to something else. Here we have Rousseau, during the Enlightenment, creating a type of ideology which when you think about it, is trying to get this level of consensus, like Calvin in Geneva, creating a sort of secular religion, which will hopefully draw out this level of conformity and unanimity and self-alienation, to the greater whole.
So they're kind of saying secularized religion.
Secularized religion, you can see here. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Right. And of course, he didn't foresee how powerful, he did foresee how powerful that could be, how badly it could be misused. Okay? But you do see a whiff of that here. And like I said, if you're interested actually in that psychological thought, this is a book that I would recommend, Jung's The Undiscovered Self. Jung deals with how these, previously tamed, the tamed part of humanity, which goes way back to pre-civilization, to the development of primitive religion, which then becomes more sophisticated over time. He deals particularly with Christianity because he's basically dealing with the wake of World War I and World War II here. But how this develops in the human psyche and then gets a big knock on the head from modern developments and gets transferred into mass movements. So if you asked yourself, how could so many people believe in something like Nazism?
Wasn't he a Nazi?
Or in our days, not that I'm aware of, no. You might be thinking of Heidegger.
No, I thought it was, or maybe he was anti-Semitic.
I think everybody was anti-Semitic, but yes, I think to a certain extent Jung was anti-Semitic. You're probably right about that. But he has a pretty good explanation here. He's on to something. Yeah. No, he wasn't a Nazi. I know that for a fact. Anti-Semitic, I don't know if I can think of a single author, including Rousseau. I mean, it's just...
Locke wasn't anti-Semitic. Or someone we read last semester, It was like everyone, it was just the Muslims that couldn't be there. It was Locke.
Well, Locke said, Locke included, yeah, he didn't say we can't tolerate Jews.
Yeah.
He said we could tolerate Jews. I'm trying to think. You may be right. I've read a lot of Locke. I'm not thinking of anything explicitly anti-Semitic. So you may have something there.
It probably was.
It's terrible, you know. I mean, how long it took for people to even question the deep-seated prejudice against Jews in very sophisticated people, you know, otherwise in political thought and philosophy. Heidegger is a case of a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party, anti-Semite. Hannah Arendt, who herself was Jewish,
Mm-hmm.
Heidegger's girlfriend.
Yeah.
It's weird.
That's weird.
It is weird. So, I mean, I can try to look that up and see, because I'm gonna, I may try to teach Jung in the future. Want to make sure. But, and you know, Rousseau. Do we see any blatant anti-Semitism in Rousseau? I haven't seen that. He's more anti-traditional religion, though. I mean, in general.
But interestingly, he's not as anti-Christian as like Hobbes was. Like he doesn't really. I mean, I haven't seen like.
He doesn't go hammer and tong against it. Yeah. But in this setting of the social contract, what we get is not Christianity, but more of a general belief, something that can unify a lot of different people. You have to believe in God, you have to believe in some sort of afterlife maybe, but you know, there's no, the details are missing there. Okay, so in that way we know he's different from Hobbes on that score of risking your life for your country. Okay. So, and I'm going to skip that last page because we get to the same point in the next handout. So we've just got a few more minutes. Now, okay. So he ends up arguing that the general will needs to be guided and shaped. Okay, so it just doesn't come up spontaneously. All right, so how are you going to guide and shape the general will so that it is not mistaken? Okay, because he says, you know, people when they get together can sometimes be misled. They can be led astray, either through their own deliberation or more likely through speakers, people who propose ideas that are for their interests but not for the good of all. Okay, so we need to have a set of things in place to avoid the so-called will of all. This is on page 3 of your handout, which is the will of all as individuals, and to obtain the true general will. Okay, so one of the ways that he proposes doing this is by getting rid of what we would call factions. Hobbes called, you know, parties and groups that are set apart. Remember, Hobbes talked about the need to get rid of the power of the barons and the aristocrats. They might continue to exist, but we had to get rid of their political power. Feudalism needed to come to an end, and we needed to have that power concentrated in the monarchy or in the sovereign. Well, Rousseau agrees that when you have these, what he calls partial societies or factions, you get automatic disagreement, of course. That's what they do. So we have to make sure they don't exist. So he agrees with Hobbes there. Hobbes says they cannot be allowed. He says on 438, chapter 4, for the general will to be well articulated, it is therefore important that there should be no partial society in the state, and that each citizen make up his own mind. And he goes back to Rome for this, and Rome is his go-to example, as I'm sure you've noticed. Such was the unique and sublime institution of the great lawgiver, Lycurgus. If there are partial societies, their number must be multiplied and inequality among them prevented, as was done by Solon, Numa, and Servius, all leaders of Rome. These precautions are the only effective way of bringing it about that the general will is always enlightened and that the populace is not tricked. So the best way is to outlaw them. If you can't outlaw them, make them so numerous. That comes a little closer to Madison, I guess, but make them so numerous that they're completely ineffective.
I was thinking the same thing. That
Maybe there's a
Closer.
little bit of Rousseau in Madison.
Yeah.
Well, let's not think about that.
Yeah.
But it's a problem, you know. And that's a historical example of what was done in that particular case. But surely Rousseau would sooner outlaw them. You can't have the general will if you have these factions. Okay, so that's one thing you can do. And then another thing that he discusses right away in chapter 7 is that in order for this all to work well, you need to have a lawgiver like Lycurgus or like Romulus, the mythical founder of Rome. You may recall Thomas More in his Utopia said much the same thing. You need to have that founder figure. The founder will create, hopefully, this sense of looking back, like we do on Madison, as sort of the point in time in which this all started and whose laws we have to respect. So when we come back on Friday, we can start into the lawgiver.